All right, Days of Wonder. Now, when people hear Days of Wonder, I think the first game that comes to mind is Ticket to Ride. And yes, I agree with the masses that Ticket to Ride's a great entry level, board game to the hobby, and I appreciate what that game has done for the hobby, as it seems like it definitely has got a lot of people into board gaming and has opened up a lot of eyes to a lot of the other great games that there are in the industry. Personally, Ticket to Ride just never was a meaty enough game to really get my interest, but I definitely would play it if someone that was newer to the hobby really wanted to play that game. Another game, though, that I think deserves just as much credit as Ticket to Ride in terms of what it's done for this hobby is Memoir 44 from Days of Wonder. Now, Memoir 44 is a World War II tactical board game, and in it, each side is controlling either the ally, one side controlling the allies, one side's controlling some Axis power. There's tons of expansions that have been released over the years to bring in other nationalities into the game, but base game is Germans and Americans. And it's a tactical war game that I would say probably is the leading entry-level war game in the hobby, and for that reason alone, I think it does deserve a lot of credit. The rules are pretty simple, and it's a lot of fun. It's a game that on your turn you have 4 or 5 cards, and each card basically tells you which area of the board you can activate units on. There's really not a ton of decision making that you can really do, because you only have then 4 or 5 decisions essentially per turn based on what's in your hand of cards. And then obviously if you have no soldiers in that section of the board, you're not going to play that card at all. So really you might only have like 3 choices then to choose from, which for a new war gamer, that's enough choices. A lot of course, more difficult war games then give you way too many maybe choices of what you can do on your turn, which then can kind of become overwhelming for the player. So that right there is a great reason why I think Memoir 44 does a good job of bringing war gamers into the hobby. And the system that Memoir 44 uses, I should say, is called the Command and Color system, which has been implemented in a variety of different war games besides Memoir 44 in a variety of different themes, which I will touch on soon later in this video. But in this particular case, I do want to give a lot of credit then to the designer of that system, Richard Board. So of all the Command and Color games, though, I think Memoir 44 has definitely achieved the most notoriety and is still a very popular game to this day, even though I think it was published all the way back in 2004. And right there, I think, is a great reason for why Days of Wonder has to be considered one of the top board game publishing companies, for the fact that they have Memoir 44 in their name, and then also Ticket to Ride, which to this day is also considered one of the leading entry-level board games in the hobby. So that's Days of Wonder. All right, the next company that I want to talk about is Fantasy Flight Games, or FFG. Now, if I hadn't said that Chip Theory Games is my #1 board game company, then I'd probably have to give that designation to Fantasy Flight Games, for very similar reasons as to why I think Chip Theory Games is such a great company. #1, Fantasy Flight was based in Minnesota, and they have great component quality and a lot of just great fun games that I'll touch on some of them now. You can see, though, my Fantasy Flight game collection is the biggest collection I have from any publishing company, which then, not surprisingly, is the reason why I consider them a top board game publishing company. So, where to get started with FFG? Well, the first game I want to touch on is the game that I would say is my favorite game. Now, as a board gamer, when you tell someone that you're interested in board games, or that's a big, one of your interests, or in general, you're a fan of the board game hobby, the next question to follow that is typically, what's your favorite board game? And I think a lot of us board gamers struggle with that question for a couple reasons. The first reason might be, is this person I'm talking to, do they know anything about the board game hobby? Do they just think of Monopoly and life as board games? Because if that's the case, then if I tell them my favorite board game is Spirit Island, they're going to look at me with a blank stare, and I have no idea what I'm talking about. So do I have to keep that in mind? And then, how do I go about answering this question without making them, feel dumb, or without trying to make them, or without myself looking elitist or egotistical or whatever? Or the second reason that you may struggle with that question, which is the case for me, is you have so many board games that you haven't even really played a lot, so you can't really feel you have a number one board game since you really aren't even playing any specific board game that often because you have so many to play. So how can you honestly tell someone that you have a favorite board game if in the reality is you actually don't even play your board games that much? If I was hard pressed to really pick a number one board game, then I would have to choose Tide of Iron from Fantasy Flight Games. And unfortunately, the reality is I have not played this game nearly as much as I would like to say I have played it. But with that said, everything about that game just speaks to me loud and clear. I can't remember, it was at least 10, maybe 15 years ago when I got that game. And I remember seeing it in the store, looking at it and thinking, this is just like, my childhood, but now in a board game form. And I was just getting into the board game hobby. And that game just looked like a lot of fun to me. I love the fact that the units in the game were all these cool little figures, and I mentioned earlier that, I love playing with toy soldiers growing up. So, war games then kind of naturally fell into my area of interest when starting to get into board games. But Tide of Iron, of all the World War II themed board games out there, or war themed board games out there, really appealed to me the most because I really liked all the miniatures that came with the game. I love the terrain that comes with the game. The combat system to me is really straightforward. It makes a lot of sense. I like how with mortar crews you can try to attack for just casualties and try to roll for hits, or you can try to roll for morale damage and try just to pin the enemy. And I like the fact that when your squad takes a hit, you simply just remove a figure from the squad's base. In Memoir 44, the problem I always had with that game is, even though I was just saying it is a great entry-level war game, and it was just a little too abstracted for me. I don't like the fact that when I have one single figure left in a unit that it's still rolling 3 dice. Like, to me, it should be rolling 1 dice. There's only 1 figure left. Whereas in Tide of Iron, if you have a squad with just 1 figure, you only are now rolling 1 combat dice. So, things like that are what really brought me into the Tide of Iron game. And there's this whole card element included in the game as well, where you have cards that you can try to play each turn, but you can only play cards if you have the resources, and to get those resources you have to control the resource points on the game map. Not only then did I get the base game from FFG, I have all the expansion content for Tide of Iron, and I got all the expansion content from 1A Games as well for Tide of Iron. Eventually Fantasy Flight unfortunately sold the Tide of Iron title to 1A Games, a company that unfortunately now is no longer in business. And my hope is that 1A was going to at least come out with a Pacific-themed version or expansion for Tide of Iron, and that never came to fruition. I have a personal mission to somehow, someday, bring back Tide of Iron via maybe Kickstarter or something, and hopefully find a publishing company that will take this title back on and come out with the additional content it deserves. But I feel like it just went under the radar over the years, and Memoir 44 kind of took the leading spot as entry-level war game. And this definitely, I wouldn't say, is an entry-level war game by any means. I would say it's more closer to medium weight. But for me personally, it's the exact middle ground for me in terms of war game experience. So that's just one title from Fantasy Flight Games. What else do they have? Well, like I said, they have so much stuff. I'm not going to be able to talk about everything. Right here, you can see all their other big titles: Dust Tactics, Horse Heresy, Warcraft the board game, Starcraft the board game, all really solid titles. But I think I'd be remiss if I don't touch on their Star Wars games. And I think the Star Wars games that Fantasy Flight has put out have all been massive successes, starting with what many will consider Star Wars in a box, which is Star Wars Rebellion. And much like how War of the Ring from Ares Games is Lord of the Rings in the box, Star Wars Rebellion is Star Wars in a box, big strategy game, dudes on the map game, that allows you to kind of recreate a lot of the epic moments in the Star Wars original trilogy. So amazing game here. Really lets you feel like you're reliving all those childhood memories of the Star Wars universe. Then, of course, they have great Star Wars miniature titles. So they have Star Wars X-Wing, Star Wars Armada, Star Wars Legion. And then, of course, Star Wars Imperial Assault, which is the Star Wars themed version of their Descent game, which I don't have Descent. I have Star Wars Imperial Assault, but Descent's a great dungeon crawling experience, and so is Imperial Assault. So, yeah, am I leaving out a lot of great stuff from Fantasy Flight? Yes. But that is exactly why they are a top board game publishing company, because there's so many great things to talk about from them that I can't fit it all in this one video. So let's move on before I add another 10 minutes to why Fantasy Flight's such a great board game company.